the president of the university, the provost, members of the governing board, members of the academic council, deans, faculty members, distinguished invitees, and most important of all, the graduating students. I'm honored and humbled that I've been invited here today as the chief guest for this convocation function. I've heard a lot about AURO University. This happens to be my first visit here. I hope it's not going to be the last. I said I thank you for having invited me to this convocation. But I must confess, I don't particularly like the word convocation. It has a Western kind of nuance to it. Traditionally, we would have called it Dikshanta Samarabha or Samavartan. To me, the word Samavartan carries even more of a nuance because it has the nuance of return. It has the nuance of return in the sense that a student has studied in his or her Gurukula and has now returned and is at the threshold of life. It is therefore, Samavartan is therefore one of our samskaras, loosely translated in English as sacrament. You're at that particular threshold when you are stepping out and you don't quite know what that future holds. Before every samskara, before every threshold in our systems, it is customary to purify oneself through a bath. Which is why those of you who are graduating today are snatakas, from the same root etymologically as snana. You have purified yourselves and you have set out. Your provost told you, Subhaste Panthana. I don't know how many of you know where this is from. This is from Kalidasa's Avigyan Shakuntalam. When the sage Kanva blesses Shakuntala when she is going out of the hermitage. And those of you who know about the Shakuntala story know that life for her was not particularly smooth. There were trials and there were tribulations before she eventually reached and attained her goal. You have obtained all the skills that equip you to face life. There is a Sanskrit shloka which says, Acharyat padamarapte padam shishya swamedhaya padam sabrahmacharedha padam kala kramenacha. You learn 1/4 from the preceptor. 1/4 the shishya learns through his or her own efforts. 1/4 he or she learns from the peers, the fellow students, and 1/4 time and destiny teach you. I personally happen to think that much more than 1/4 will be taught to you by time, will be taught to you by destiny. The first convocation address that I can think of is actually a convocation address that is there in the Taittiriya Samhita. In the Shikshavalli part, the 11th Anuvaka. You are familiar with only a small part of it, which we have picked up for various reasons, and that small part is Atithi Deva Bhava. What you may not know is that that is actually from a Samavartan address, which amongst other things says, Swadhyaya ma pramada, Esha adesha, Esha upadesha, Esha dharma sanatana. Do not forget the self-study. And self-studying is what destiny will teach you. I do not know what your average age is, probably about 22 or 23. Let's say 20. When you're around 20, you have all kinds of aspirations, you have all kinds of hopes, you have all kinds of ambitions. You want to take on the world. When you attain the age of 40, you realize that instead of you taking on the world has taken you on. When you are at the age of 60 roughly, which is where I am, you realize it does not matter one way or the other. And if you live to be 80, if at all, you realize that both you and the world are illusions. Therefore, no matter what you plan, rest assured that all your plans will generally go wrong. And therefore, I will not wish for you, may you get what you want. Instead, I will wish for you, may you want what you get. Life is, as your president told you, discovering the hidden potential, the hidden destiny that is inside all of us. Particularly in a place like Surat, I hope people like you will not necessarily look for jobs. Instead, I hope you will provide jobs to others. I hope you will become entrepreneurs. I hope you will be part of what the Prime Minister has referred to as Stand Up India, Make Up India. There is nothing wrong with making money. There is nothing wrong with making wealth, as long as, of course, it is made through legitimate means. At the beginning, we heard a Saraswati Vandana. Saraswati sits on a lotus. She is seated on a lotus. Sheta Padmasana. Lakshmi also is seated on a lotus. Rakta Padmasana. But they both happen to be seated on lotuses, and therefore there is no particular conflict between Saraswati and Lakshmi. So I hope you do go out and make that money. But when you go out and make that money, do realize that quite often we tend to search for that elusive happiness in terms of relationships with the external world. External world meaning possession of objects. External world meaning external relationships. Relationships with grandparents, relationships with parents, relationships with spouses, relationships with sons, grandchildren, daughters, subordinates, people who are subordinate to you. That elusive happiness, that elusive serenity, that elusive tranquility is never in terms of relationships with the external world, other people or objects. It is inside you. And one of the best places to have learned that lesson is, of course, a place like AURO University. So I do hope that you find that inside you. When you go out into that wide world, you will legitimately complain about the government, what the government should do. The government should do this, the government should do that. I've been to the United States, in the US, these things happen. Why can't they happen in India? In Western Europe, these kinds of things happen. Why can't they happen in India? Do remember, apples must be compared with apples. Apples cannot be compared with oranges. India's per capita income today is 2,000 US dollars. 2,000 US dollars? Is that high or low? How do I know? Things like these are not absolute. Things like these are relative. There was a famous economist named Lord Keynes. Whenever something clever was said in the area of economics and finance, and you don't know who said it, it was invariably attributed to Lord Keynes. Just as in the area of literature, as your provost will tell you, whenever something clever was said and you do not know who it could be attributed to, it was attributed to Oscar Wilde. So like that, apparently Lord Keynes was once asked, "How is your wife?" And he said, "Compared to whose wife?" So 2,000 US dollars, is that high or low? Well, the richest country in the world has a per capita income of 175,000 US dollars. 175,000 US dollars, 2,000 US dollars. The United States in the 1870s, not the 1970s, in the 1870s, the United States in today's dollars had a per capita income of 3,000 US dollars. So do go out and complain. Do say that the government should do this and that, but do not lose your sense of proportion. The government has a mandate, and the government's mandate is to deliver several of the things that you take for granted, which have been deprived in disadvantaged parts of India, the 100,000 villages of India that have not had them historically. Gandhiji said, "India lives in its villages." People quote it. Clever people misquote it and say, "India dies in its villages." Very few people have actually read a particular passage where Gandhiji said this, because that particular passage gives you a number of the number of villages that India had then. And the number of villages India had then was 700,000. Today it has come down to 600,000. Over a period of time, villages disappear. They become uninhabited. They become part of larger agglomerations. They are reclassified from the census point of view. The point remains that it is a travesty that 7 decades after independence, 100,000 of India's 600,000 villages until recently lacked the roads, the metal roads we take for granted, The LPG gas we take for granted, the electricity we take for granted, the primary health center we take for granted. So the primary responsibility of any government is to deliver to those, not to deliver to you and me, and you and me, we are privileged. Why are we privileged? Because you've had access to education. Why are you privileged? You are privileged because you have had access to higher education. Even today, 25% of the young India still has access to higher education. 75% does not. So you are privileged. I guess you must have had some exposure to the Constitution of India. The preamble to the Indian Constitution does not begin with the statement, "we the government." It begins with the statement, "we the people." India is not going to change only because governments do this and governments do that. India is going to change because you are going to change India as citizens. I'm not talking about corporate social responsibility. I am indeed saying it's a moral responsibility for those of you who are privileged because of that access to pay back to society in whatever form you see fit. It is that way that India will change when you as citizens begin to change India. In the course of my work, I have to travel quite a bit throughout India. When I travel through India, I sense a vibrant India. I sense an impatient India. I sense an entrepreneurial India. I sense that young India. When we were young, when we were students, we used to be told that there were three kinds of countries in the world. Developed countries, developing countries, and the worst of amongst those developing countries, and those were known as LDCs, least developed countries. All of these terms have now fallen out of fashion. One does not use them. But when we were students, that is what we used to be told. Developed countries, developing countries, LDCs. When I first began to teach, I realized that there was a fourth kind of country also, and that was a RDC. And there was only one country in the world which was part of that RDC bracket, and that was India, and RDC stood for refusing to develop country. About India, it has often been said that the past is glorious, the future is glorious, and the present alone is bleak. It is now for the first time that I find a blurring of the present with the future. When we were students and we went abroad, we were perpetually defensive about India, at least so far as its economic power was concerned. The discourse about India then, when we were students in the external world, was generally yoga and Indian cuisine. That discourse has completely changed, and it has largely changed because of that entrepreneurial India. And India has plenty of entrepreneurship. As your president demonstrates. I hope you will not misunderstand me when I say that corporate India exhibits very little of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is defined as an ability and an appetite for taking risks. Corporate India rarely takes risks. Entrepreneurship is really exhibited by the poor Indian farmer. Entrepreneurship is really exhibited by the vendor on the streets of Surat and other cities who perpetually has to take risks to evade the high-handedness of the police and the municipal authorities. So there is plenty of entrepreneurship in India, and one of the things this particular government has been trying to do is to unleash that entrepreneurship. India is young. India is impatient. A generation like yours does not have a chip on its shoulder about the colonial legacy. It is a generation that was either born after 1991 or it is a generation that has grown up after 1991. So it is a confident generation. But do remember that India is not going to remain young indefinitely. Beyond the year 2035, India is also going to age. So this window of opportunity that the young India gives us is only a limited opportunity. It's only a limited window. This country of ours was left to us in trust by our forefathers. Our generations will now leave it in trust to you. It is for you to ensure that India grows and develops and prospers. It is for you to ensure that 40 years from now, when one of you is invited to come here and be the chief guest for a convocation at AURO University, you will no longer say that the future will arrive. You will say that the promised future has already arrived. I'm not speaking to those of you who will pursue elusive green cards. I am speaking to those of you who will live in India, will work in India, because this India is yours to build. A few days from now, we will celebrate our Independence Day. A few days from now, if not earlier, we will hear the national anthem. I am speaking to those of you for whom that national anthem leads to a stirring of the blood. India is impatient. From the snow-capped mountains in the Himalayas of Jammu and Kashmir to where the ocean laps against the shore in Kanyakumari, from the arid, salty deserts of Gujarat, not very far from here, to the lush green forests of Arunachal Pradesh. That is your India. That India is in the food you eat. That India is in the water you drink. That India is in the air that you breathe. Go and build that India. Shubhamastu, Shubhaste Panthana. Thank you once again.